Okay, we're going to go over some interval notation because this is something that we're going to use a lot throughout the class. And interval notation is used to give domains. So I'm going to focus on one particular question for these notes. Our main focus is being able to use interval notation, but we're also going to look at this question, where is a function positive and negative? So a function is positive if it is above the x-axis. So for example here, I'm going to get the highlighter, and this function is going to be positive right here because it's above the x-axis. And it's going to be negative in this section of the graph. So that's what we're looking at here. And you can see that right there at that point, at 1, 0, the function switched from positive to negative. So I'm going to put myself in a dotted line right here. So we always want to think about the x values whenever we're answering these questions. So we're looking for the domain or the x values where f of x or the y value is positive. So we're looking for the x value. So if we're talking about positive here, the function becomes positive right here, right past 1, and it's going to stay positive forever. This is a square root function, so that I don't have an arrow right there, but it does continue on forever in this direction. So if we were using just using inequality notation, we would say that x is greater than 1. I would not use an or equal to sign here because right there at 1, our y value is 0. And 0 is neither positive nor negative, so I'm not going to include that point there. So I'm just going to say x is greater than 1. Okay, so to say where this function is negative, I would look at my x values. Now this is a square root function, and this square root function, I'm going to add me another dotted line here. This square root function is going to end right there at that point. So just between these two green lines do we have a function that is negative. Now our x value here is -3, and then of course we've already said our x value here is 1. So if I'm going to write the answer for when this function is negative in inequality notation, then I would say -3 is less than or equal to x less than 1. I'm using a less than or equal to here for -3 because we do have a point on the graph there at which the function is negative. Anything below -3 is not going to be in our domain for the function, so we won't include it, but we do include -3. We do not include 1 for the same reason we did not include 1 right here. Right there at 1, our y value is 0, and 0 is neither negative nor positive. So this would be our inequality notation. Now, whenever we're dealing with interval notation, the way that we're going to write this for the first part of the question, where we're asked if the function is positive, is when we write interval notation, we basically are saying from here to there. So, and remember, always talking about those x values. So right here we have from 1 to, and you can see this keeps going in this direction forever. So we're talking about this section of the graph and over. So we would say this is from 1 to infinity. And whenever we're doing interval notation, if we use a parentheses, that is similar to having a greater than or less than sign. And it means that the value is not included. So we have that 1 we don't actually include, so we use a parentheses here. Infinity you're always going to use a parentheses with because infinity is not a number that we can actually reach. So you can't get to infinity, so you can't include infinity. Now, for the second one, where we're looking at where the function is negative, we're going from -3 to 1. So we're looking at this section of the graph, from -3 to +1 on our x-axis. And so we would write it like this, -3, 1. And we're going to use a parentheses here for 1 because 1 is not included. But we're going to use a bracket right here for -3. So whenever we see brackets, those are like having the less than or equal to or the greater than or equal to signs. And it tells us that the value is included. Okay, let's do another example here. Alright, so again, same question. We're looking for where this function is positive and where it is negative. So positive is going to be where it's above the x-axis. And actually, let me use yellow for that like I did on the last problem. So right here we're above the x-axis, and right here we're above the x-axis. In these sections, we are below the x-axis. That graph got cut off there, but assume that it's continuous there. So I'm going to put me in some dotted lines like I did on the last problem. So from right here to right here, our function is positive, and then from right here over, our function is positive. So if I was going to write this in inequality notation, I would say that this function is positive from negative, let's switch to a pen here, -2 less than x less than -1. And that would be this section right here. In interval notation, it would look like this, from -2 to -1. Okay. Right here, I can see that that's the section of the graph from -2 to +1. Sometimes over here on this section, it can be a little bit confusing because this is so steep, and we like to think in terms of y's, but we're really thinking in terms of x's. So even though this graph is very steep, it is going over in this direction, so the graph is going to be positive from 1 in this direction forever, which is to infinity. So in inequality notation, that would just be x is greater than 1. But in interval notation, we would say from 1 to infinity. And we could use the word and here, or there is a mathematical symbol that means and that we use sometimes, and it is this upside down U right here. So you may see that written instead of the word and. Now let's look at where this graph is negative. So right here, whenever we're looking at this graph, we can see over here in this part of the graph that our function is below the x-axis. Now this can be a little bit tricky because students often want to say -2 to -infinity, or they might be even thinking y to -infinity. But whenever we write in interval notation, we always have to put our lowest value first. So we could write this with interval notation and just say x is less than -2. But if we're writing in, I'm sorry, that's inequality notation. If we write in interval notation, we have to say -infinity to -2 here. And we also have this section over here, and that, because that section is from here to here, so from -1 to +1. So we would say -1 is less than x less than 1. And we can write it in interval notation, -1, 1. We're using parentheses there because right there at the x-axis, the function is neither negative nor positive. Let's try another one. Okay, here is another graph, and if we look at this graph, let's get the highlighter out. This graph is going to be positive on these sections of the graph. It is going to be negative on this section of the graph. So I'm going to put in some dotted lines like I did on the last one. These vertical dotted lines just help me split up my x-axis. And if I'm asked where this function is, let's actually do the negative first because it's a little bit easier. When we're looking at the negative, it's this section right here from 0 to 3. So our answer in inequality notation would be 0 less than x less than 3. In interval notation, it would be 0, 3, from 0 to 3. Now, the positive part is what is going to really throw students off a lot of times right here. So whenever we're thinking about the positive section that we see right here that's yellow, we are looking at everything that falls on this side of this dotted line. So in inequality notation, we could just say x is less than 0. In interval notation, a lot of students get this wrong because they'll say from 0 to positive infinity. And they're saying to positive infinity because as you go from 0 up, you're going up, 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 which makes you think positive infinity. But that is thinking about the y coordinates. We're thinking about the x-axis only. So if we're thinking about how to describe this part of the graph right here, we have to put the lowest value of this section first, which would be way over here at negative infinity. So we would say from negative infinity to 0, like so. So you're thinking from negative infinity to 0. That's this section of the graph here. Now, there's also a little trick with the next part of the graph, because we are looking for where the function is positive, and we might be tempted to say for anything x is greater than 3. However, if we look right here at 5, our y value is 0. Remember that 0 is neither negative nor positive. So for this one, we would have to say 3 less than x less than 5. So from 3 to 5. And x is greater than 5. So, and 5 to infinity. Now that excludes the 5 because we have parentheses in both places. So right there at 5, we're not including that point because the function is neither positive nor negative at that point. Okay, we've got one more example that we're going to look at with a graph. So again, we're looking for positives and negatives. So let's go back and make that yellow. We've got a positive in these two sections, and we have negatives here. And I'm going to do like I've done on the last few problems and put me in some dotted vertical lines. Okay, so here when we're answering the question for positive, we're looking from here to here, which is 0 to 1. So we could write it 0 less than x less than 1, or 0, 1. And from 3 to 4, so 3 less than x less than 4, or we could write this from 3 to 4. And so those would be our sections where our graph is positive. Where our graph is negative, we are looking at this section here, this middle section here, and also this section here. Now remember, we're always thinking from left to right, so we're thinking from here to here. So we're thinking, we could write it x is less than negative 5. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not negative 5. This is 0. Let's fix that. Looking at the wrong thing there. X is less than 0. Or we can say from negative infinity up to 0. Okay. And we also have this middle section from 1 to 3, so 1 less than x less than 3. So from 1 to 3. And again, this is another one that throws students off right here. We're looking at x is greater than 4. But remember, we're always looking from left to right on the x-axis. So we're talking about this section, which begins at 4 and ends at infinity. So from 4 to positive infinity. Always make sure when you're using interval notation that in your parentheses that the lowest number comes first for these. So we will practice a little more with interval notation tomorrow when we start looking at the graphs of logarithms. So you should be answering these questions as you go along. If you have questions, let me know tomorrow at the beginning of class.